Pardon my voice this morning. I came back from a week in California, so it was worth the trade to be in the warm air and to come back on the plane, and you know how that works. But when I was among all my colleagues there, about 450 UU ministers near Monterey, California, we heard many presentations from many people, some of them UUs, some of them not. And it reminded me of many years ago, I was again among several hundred of my colleagues as we listened to a speech given by the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Do you remember that name? This was about a year before Reverend Wright became widely known as the infamous pastor of the Obama family. At the time I heard him speak, he wasn't yet a media punching bag. He was merely a successful leader of a large UCC congregation in Chicago. And we had invited him to our Ministers Association gathering to share stories with us of how he had helped grow his congregation to serve the diverse needs of their members and their larger community. He gave a brilliant presentation, without notes, I might add. It was filled with lots of great stories and ideas for building more vibrant religious communities of hope and justice. It was easy to be inspired by his vision of what can be possible in a generous, focused, connected church, like the one we've been striving to build here in Des Moines. In one of his stories, he told us of how he had questioned the emphasis that churches often place on premarital counseling, saying that in his experience, couples don't really need the counseling before they get married. They need it afterwards. And so he helped put together this monthly program at his church for married couples to cover topics that often challenge them, including sessions on finances, parenting, family systems, communication, sex, and so on. Couples could join in at any point in the annual cycle. They could repeat sessions. It's a great idea, right? This is the kind of program that large churches with lots of people and resources can offer. As his church staff was getting ready to roll the program out to the congregation for the first time, they hadn't yet figured out a good name for it. These names, they matter to us, church people. So he shared his struggle with a colleague who wasn't part of the church, and he gave it a few days of thought and then called him back with great enthusiasm, saying, "Jeremiah, I know what you should name your class for married couples." "Oh, yes," Reverend Wright responded. "You should call it, 'What in the World Have I Done?'" I thought about that story recently when I read that only 3 in 10 of the couples who get married will share happy, healthy marriages. Only 3 in 10. Those aren't very good odds, are they? As a minister, when I stand with couples to officiate their weddings, it's easy to get caught up in the moment with them. By the time these couples share their public vows, I've gotten to know them well enough to share their excitement. I've heard stories of how they met and what they most admire about each other. I've heard about their backgrounds and career interests, their expectations for the future. Sometimes they tell me about challenges they have faced, but typically in these early stages of their relationships, they have mostly just good things to report. And so I, too, have come to share, without reservation in most cases, an eager anticipation for their future together. By the time these couples say "I do," I'm rarely thinking of how, statistically speaking, more than 2/3 of them are going to be unhappy. And I don't just mean occasionally unhappy. I mean perpetually unhappy. I mean divorced or together only in name. On their wedding day, I'm not thinking of these odds against them sharing a happy future, and neither are they, or else they wouldn't be getting married, right? But even if I shared these odds with them, I'm guessing most of them would go forward anyway, and that's because for most of them, getting married is an act of faith. It's an act that's not based on proof. It's a commitment that's rooted in a belief that they will try to navigate life's ambiguities together, for better or for worse, adjusting as necessary, leading with kindness and generosity along the way, so as to preserve the bonds to one another that they are choosing. So given that most couples enter into marriage with faith in their future happiness, what goes wrong such that more than 2/3 of them don't see their faith realized? And what about the couples among those, the third that are happy? What do they know that enables them to find the happiness that eludes others? Well, these are questions that have been posed by social scientists for decades, and their findings have much to tell us, not only about what makes for healthy marriages, but also, I contend, for what it means to be a people of faith. John Gottman is one of these social scientists. In 1986, he and a colleague invited newlyweds to be interviewed. They hooked them up to electrodes and then asked these couples to talk about their relationships. The researchers recorded their physiological responses to these questions and then sent the couples home. 6 years later, they invited the couples back for another interview to see if they were still together and to see if any conclusions could be drawn from the data that had been collected 6 years previous. Well, the results of this study led Gottman to describe two major categories for couples. They could be divided pretty easily. He called them the masters and the disasters. The masters being those, obviously, who stayed together and who claimed happiness, and the disasters being those who had separated or who were not happy. Reviewing the data that he had collected, Gottman discovered that even if the disaster couples looked relaxed in their first interviews, their physical responses actually showed that they were more agitated than the master couples during the conversations, that they were more likely to show physiological signs of anxiety in the presence of their significant other that suggested a lack of trust and intimacy. The master couples, meanwhile, had apparently developed ways of being together through which they could be more calm emotionally and therefore physically. In their lack of physical reactivity to each other, the master couples displayed evidence of some kind of positive emotional climate in their relationship that Gottman concluded had likely contributed to their happiness, right, many years later. So Gottman wanted to know more about how the master couples created a loving climate of intimacy and trust that helped keep them together and happy, and how the disaster couples didn't. So he gathered 130 newlywed couples a few years later to spend a day at a retreat that he had set up like a bed and breakfast. The couples were observed as they shared a day of relating and relaxing in this vacation-like setting. They're just hanging out. Just as before, they were invited back for a follow-up interview 6 years later. In studying the previous behaviors of these couples through the lens of their later relationships, Gottman discovered a component of the initial interaction styles they had exhibited that was of critical importance for their future together. The couples who would end up being most happy were those who were good at turning toward each other's bids, as he called them. These requests they made, both subtle and overt, for their partner's attention and connection. During the retreat, Gottman observed that partners would make bids of one another. What does he mean by bids? Well, for example, in conversation, one partner might point out a bird out the window or something, or maybe a story from the news. Another might share a piece of music or a memory from their childhood. In pointing out these things, the partners are asking for a response from their significant other, hoping that they will connect with their partner, if even just for a moment. They are, in essence, making a bid for each other's attention. Once the bid has been made, the partner receiving the bid then, of course, has a decision to make. Will they respond by turning toward the bid? Will they engage with their partner, thereby supporting the bid? Or will they turn away by not responding, or by doing so without much thought or care, only to return to whatever they were doing in the first place? And if they do turn away, how do they do it? Do they do it with kindness, saying something like, I want to consider what you're saying, but I can't right now. Can you give me a moment? Or do they respond with hostility? Can't you see I'm reading right now? And so on. Throughout the day of the retreat, each partner made bids in different ways and at different times. And as you would expect, some bids were more intimate in nature, and some would seem to be more mundane. Still, Gottman found that the overall tendency of couples to receive and turn toward the bids their partners made was a strong predictor of the quality of their marriages years later. In fact, 6 years after the retreat, the couples who had separated had turned toward each other's bids during the retreat only 33% of the time. Only 3 in 10 of their requests for connection received a loving, attentive response. Meanwhile, the couples who were still together 6 years later turned toward each other's bids at the retreat 87% of the time. Nearly 9 times out of 10, these couples had chosen to respond to their partner's bids to connect. Now, just by observing how bids are received or not, Gottman has been able to correctly predict almost without fail whether couples will be happy several years later or not. And he's able to make these predictions whether the couples are gay or straight, rich or poor, whether they have kids or not. Their future happiness, it seems, is dependent upon their ability to respond to each other's bids with kindness, with compassion, with generosity, more than with disregard or criticism or hostility. Gottman says, there's a habit of mind that masters have. They are scanning for things they can appreciate and say thank you for. They are building a culture of respect and appreciation very purposefully. Disasters, he continues, are scanning for partners' mistakes. Now, you may be thinking, duh, right now. Of course, the couples who are kind to each other, who pay attention to their partner's needs, who participate in their relationships, focus more on what they can give rather than on what they will receive, more on what they can praise, less on what they can criticize, are those who will find more happiness in the long run. Why would we think otherwise? But we don't always behave as if we know this, do we? Ever since I've been reading and thinking about relationship bids, I can see how I don't. I've been seeing more clearly these bids in my own marriage, and I've been seeing my own patterns of response. And I do okay sometimes, but other times I see how I could be more kind, more compassionate, more generous, more responsive. And I've been seeing the bids that come my way from others in my life too. So if you think this is just about married people, listen. I've been seeing more clearly the bids from my children, for example. Just the other night, I'd put my youngest daughter to bed, and I was looking forward to some downtime. Upon my return to the living room, my eldest daughter, who for some reason was still up, asked me to play cards with her. It wasn't a school night, so it was a legitimate request, and I didn't really want to play cards. It was late. It'd been a long day. I was tired. But to reject her bid, to choose to watch television or scan through Facebook over engaging with my daughter would have been a turning away from her that wouldn't serve me or our relationship well in the long run. I could see how she was asking me to invest in our relationship. And so I chose to turn toward her bid. I chose to play cards. And of course, I was glad that I did. And so was she, especially because she beat me 2 out of 3 games. As a parent, much of my life, it seems, is filled with turning towards others' bids, especially those of my children and my wife as we try to meet their needs. This is the way it must be when our children depend on us. Now, I know when I was a new parent, I resented the claim that all these bids made on my life. I resented it. It's not that I didn't love my child or that I didn't want to do my share of the parenting or the household duties. I just missed the days when I didn't have to be so responsible. The days when I was more free to come and go as I pleased, more free to do what I wanted without thinking so much about other people. I missed the time to be just Mark. But eventually, slower than it should have been probably, I came to learn what other parents before me have learned. Maybe I didn't have so-called Mark time the way I once knew it, but I did have Mark time all the same. It's just that now, Mark time had become the time I spent with and for my family. It was a different kind of freedom, but a freedom all the same. And what a relief What a relief it was to figure that out. To let go of my unrealistic expectations of separateness and to come to peace with the gifts of my new reality. Even as I'm still learning, even as I'm still growing into it today, what a blessing to discover that the more intentional I am in receiving and responding to the bids of my companions, the more meaningful and enriching these relationships can become. Beyond marriage and parenting, there are countless other bids that each of us receives, whether we have children or not, whether we are coupled or not. No matter our place in life or our family circumstances, we receive countless bids, and we can't respond to every bid that comes our way. Clearly, we have to prioritize the bids we receive and make choices about the ones we're going to turn toward and the ones we will ignore or postpone. There are bids from our extended families. There are bids from our friends, our neighbors, bids from our community, bids from our values, from the ideas and commitments that are most important to us as we strive, each in our ways, to be the change we most want to see. And there are bids that come from our church, bids that come from a discussion or a class or a justice project that agitates us to see our lives and the lives of our neighbors differently, to stand on the side of love. There are bids that come from the young people who look to us to provide for them a home of hope and justice into which they may grow. Bids that come from inspirational or challenging sermons, like the sermon on gender that our youth Anson Tonelli offered us 2 weeks ago. How proud were you, by the way, to know that Anson had grown up in this church and will soon be going out into the world as an adult, sharing those values of love and justice that Z learned from Zer's parents and their church community. Which leads me to point out the bid that is before you this month, a bid that I contend has a lot to do with what it means to be a people of faith. This month, you're asked to make a pledge of financial support to our congregation for the year to come. Our budget year runs from July to June, and you're asked for your intentions so early so that we can effectively and responsibly budget your dollars. How many of you received a letter from me that outlines the financial needs we face in the coming year? How many of you read it? Hey, not bad, not bad. It's kind of goofy letter, right? Yeah. Lots of goofy little circles and arrows. The bid was, read me, read me, read me. We have ambitious yet reachable goals in this church, and these goals require our attention, not only in the sharing of your time and your talent, but in the sharing of your treasure too. If you have not received your letter, you're like, what's he talking about? There should be letters at the pledge table, and I want you to read them if you haven't already. Before you make your pledge, I want you to read the facts of what we are trying to do and what it's going to take to get us there. I want you to receive this bid. Now, because this letter comes from me, it may seem as though I, Reverend Mark Stringer, am making this bid of you. And if that helps you give generously, by all means, please consider the bid coming from me. But in all sincerity, right, this bid that's being made of you to make a generous pledge of financial support to this congregation before the end of this month, it's not coming from me. It's not coming from your Canvas co-chairs, volunteers, Heather and Bill. It's not coming from the board of trustees or from the church staff. This bid is coming from you. It's your bid. The bid is coming from your ideals. It's coming from your interest in building a progressive religious community that impacts lives in positive ways, that's a voice for justice and equality. It's a place where all are accepted and valued. This bid is coming from your children and your youth who can find a community of acceptance and love here unlike what they may find outside of our church. A place where they can be freely who they are called to be. A place where they can consider their own unique journeys and be inspired to be adults who will make a difference for us all. This bid is coming from families like yours who seek us out to share rites of passage like child dedications, weddings, memorial services that celebrate life and speak to humanistic values. This bid is coming from the meaningful connections that you make with each other through Sunday services, through small groups, through classes, music, justice making, and your desire to have more of these connections. This bid is coming from your desire to be inspired and challenged to live in harmony with your values and to be always expanding those values toward more love for more people more of the time. This bid is coming from you. And also from the generations of people who have been sharing the progressive faith of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines, especially that small group of religious liberals who created this congregation 137 years ago, who could only dream of what we would together become. So my question to you this morning is, how will you respond to this bid? Will you choose to turn toward this bid that's coming from your church, that's coming from you? Will you give as generously as your resources and commitment allow, knowing that every dollar makes a difference? If you have the resources, will you increase the pledge you made last year, or perhaps make a pledge for the very first time? Will you choose to make a pledge that will help your congregation to more fully become the prophetic voice and compassionate community you most want it to be? Will you offer a pledge that proclaims as boldly as your circumstances allow the same message that's printed on that shirt that I hope you'll all wear? That's free to everyone who turns in a pledge card by March 1st, the message that says, "I am First Unitarian." As I think about it, the ability that we have to be a people of faith really comes down to how we choose to turn toward the bids we receive. Faith is about turning toward the bid. Just as in marriage, as in parenting, as in all the other important relationships of our lives, the degree to which we do our best to intentionally receive and respond to the bids before us has a lot to do with the depth and the health of the relationships we can expect in return. So when you determine your pledge, whether you've been giving to this congregation for years, whether you are considering a first-time commitment to the health of this place, I invite you to consider that in a church like ours, we give not so that we can keep the lights on, but rather because having the lights on means we can be together. We give not to pay the ministers or staff, nice though that is, but because having ministers and staff to challenge and encourage us helps us transform our lives. We give not because we are obligated to, but because through our giving, this community offers us meaning and support. We give, in short, not because it makes the church possible. We give because the church helps to make all of us together possible. So again, I ask, how will you choose to contribute financially to our being together in the year to come? How will you receive this very important bid? How will you respond? May you do so with kindness, with generosity, with joy, with love. For if you do, I am confident we'll all be better off, and so will you.